You touch that wall, and I'll have every one of you arrested!
Cynthia Vale screamed at the fire marshal while a yellow bulldozer idled behind him. 3 months earlier, she had ordered the HOA to pour a 10-foot concrete wall straight across the dirt road behind my house. I warned her the road wasn't abandoned. I showed her the official survey. She ripped it in half in front of the construction crew. Then she fined me for interfering with HOA property and told the neighborhood I was a bitter old man trying to sabotage their new gated community. So I stopped arguing. I let her finish the wall. I let her spend the money. And I kept the one document she never bothered to read. The morning the fire marshal finally saw it, Cynthia was still smiling. She had no idea what was about to happen. That dirt road had been behind my house longer than most of Briar Ridge had existed. To everyone else, it looked forgotten. 2 faded tire tracks, dry weeds, an old metal marker half buried beneath brush. But I knew exactly what it was. I had spent 27 years working in city planning, reviewing subdivision maps, access agreements, development plans, and emergency routes, just like that one. My father knew the road even better. He had been a volunteer firefighter here when I was a kid. During one bad brush fire, smoke and falling trees cut off the main road into the valley. That little dirt lane behind our house was how the engines got through. Dad used to point toward it from the back porch and say, "That road looks useless until somebody's life depends on it." After he died, I kept the house. I also kept the boxes of old property records he had stored in the basement. For years, I barely thought about them. Then one Monday morning, I looked through my kitchen window and saw bright orange survey stakes behind my fence. By Tuesday, wooden forms had appeared. By Wednesday, workers were setting steel reinforcement directly across the dirt lane. I walked outside and found the foreman. "What are you building?" He barely looked up. "A permanent security wall. HOA orders." The next evening, the HOA called what Cynthia described as an emergency community meeting. The clubhouse was packed. Cynthia stood at the front beside a glossy rendering of Briar Ridge, surrounded by stone gates, security cameras, landscaping, and one continuous concrete wall. She called it the Briar Ridge Security Initiative. According to Cynthia, the neighborhood needed to feel more secure, more exclusive, more valuable. Then she clicked to the next slide. There it was. The proposed wall ran directly across the dirt road behind my house. I raised my hand. Did anyone check the recorded emergency access easement before approving this? Cynthia stared at me for a moment. Then she smiled. That road hasn't been used in years. That doesn't cancel an easement. A couple of board members shifted in their seats. Cynthia didn't. "You're retired, Mr. Mercer. Let the people responsible for this community make the decisions." A few people laughed. Then Cynthia turned back toward the screen and announced construction would begin Monday morning. Most of the room applauded. I didn't. Because Cynthia thought she was closing an abandoned trail. I knew she was about to pour concrete across something the HOA had never owned and had no authority to erase. Monday morning, I walked behind my house carrying a copy of the original subdivision survey. The concrete crew was already there. Forms stretched across the dirt lane, and a mixer truck waited nearby. I found the foreman and unfolded the map across the hood of his pickup. "Before you pour anything, look at this." He leaned closer. A red strip ran directly through the center of the proposed wall. Recorded emergency fire access. No permanent obstruction. His expression changed. "I need to call the office." He never got the chance. Cynthia's white SUV came flying down the gravel lane. She stepped out, saw the map, and marched toward us. "What are you doing?" "Stopping your contractor from building across a recorded fire easement." She grabbed the survey out of my hands. For half a second, I thought she might actually read it. Instead, she tore it down the middle. Then she tore it again, and dropped the pieces at my feet. "This is HOA property," she said. "One old piece of paper doesn't override the board." I looked at the foreman. He looked at Cynthia. She pointed toward the concrete truck. "Pour it." So I stepped back. I didn't yell. I didn't stand in front of the equipment. I didn't threaten anybody. I picked up the torn pieces, took out my phone, and started documenting everything. What Cynthia didn't notice was the security camera mounted above my neighbor's garage. It had recorded every word. The retaliation started the next morning. A violation notice was taped to my front door. $500 for interfering with authorized HOA construction. Another warning accused me of entering a restricted work zone. By lunch, Cynthia had emailed the entire neighborhood. She called me a disgruntled former city employee, spreading false information and trying to sabotage a community safety project. That part was almost impressive. She was blocking a fire route, and somehow I was the safety problem. A neighbor I'd known for 12 years stopped me near the mailbox. "Daniel, maybe you should let this go. The board has lawyers." I nodded. So do county records. That afternoon, I cleared off my dining room table and opened a fresh binder. Photos, emails, violation notices, construction dates, contractor names, meeting notes. Every conversation I could document. I wasn't preparing to win an argument with Cynthia. I was preparing for the day someone with actual authority asked what had happened. Before sunset, I found the first thing that told me Cynthia had a much bigger problem than my torn survey. I searched the county permit database. Nothing. No wall permit. The next morning, I went to the county planning office in person. I gave the clerk the project address and asked for every approval connected to the wall. She searched once. Then again. Nothing. No building permit. No emergency access review. No fire marshal approval. Not even an application asking to release or relocate the easement. Then I called Sam Patel, a surveyor I had worked with years earlier. By that afternoon, Sam was standing behind my house with a tripod and a set of county coordinates. 20 minutes later, he drove a bright orange stake into the ground beside the new foundation. "Daniel," he said, "they didn't just build across the easement." He pointed toward the concrete footing. "They're 18 inches onto your property." That alone could have started a fight. I could have demanded the crew stop. I could have called an attorney immediately. But if I stopped them then, Cynthia could still claim the whole thing was a paperwork mistake. I wanted something better. I wanted the board on record admitting they knew there was a dispute and decided to keep building anyway. So I sent Cynthia one short email. I attached the survey. I attached the permit search. I asked her to suspend construction until the records could be reviewed. Her reply came 11 minutes later. "No further discussion is necessary." That was exactly the answer I needed. 3 nights later, Cynthia called another special HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed again. She stood at the front with the board behind her and announced a vote to formally confirm that the dirt road behind my house had been abandoned and no longer served any public safety purpose. That wording caught my attention. She wasn't just building the wall anymore. She was trying to rewrite the record after the fact. When public comments opened, I stood. "Has the fire marshal approved the obstruction?" Cynthia folded her arms. "No. Has the recorded easement been legally released? No. Does the HOA have written county approval for the wall? She stared at me. We don't need it. The whispering in the room faded. So I asked one final question. Then, just so the minutes are clear, you know there's a recorded easement dispute, and you're choosing to finish the wall anyway? Cynthia smiled like she had finally cornered me. Yes, Daniel, we know about your so-called easement. And we're proceeding. I sat down. I didn't need anything else. The secretary had recorded every word. But as Cynthia moved to the next agenda item, I noticed the contractor's name on the budget sheet. Vale Development Services. Vale. Same last name as Cynthia. I knew that name. And suddenly I understood why she was in such a hurry. I went home and pulled the company registration. The owner was Cynthia's brother-in-law. That changed the entire picture. So I started going through HOA financial records. The wall had been sold to residents as a security improvement, but the contract was almost 40% higher than 2 earlier estimates the board had received. Then I found something buried in the meeting notes. Briar Ridge was negotiating with a real estate group to market the neighborhood as a private gated community. The wall had to be completed before an upcoming property valuation. If it was, several homes connected to that group could be marketed at a premium. Suddenly, Cynthia's urgency made sense. This wasn't really about safety. It was about making Briar Ridge look exclusive and using homeowners' money to pay for it. The next morning, crews installed steel posts into the unfinished section of wall. Then they mounted a polished stone sign directly over the dirt road. Briar Ridge, a secured private community. Cynthia stood beside it taking pictures. She looked proud. I took a picture too, because directly behind that expensive stone sign, half hidden beneath weeds, was the old red emergency access marker. 2 days later, someone from the fire department noticed it. A fire engine rolled slowly into Briar Ridge that afternoon. It wasn't responding to a call. The department was updating wildfire access routes before the dry season. I watched from my porch as the engine turned toward the dirt lane. Then it stopped. The new concrete wall filled the entire route. Captain Marcus Reed climbed out and stared at it. Cynthia arrived less than 5 minutes later. She told him the road had been abandoned years ago and that the HOA had already resolved the issue. Marcus didn't argue. He took pictures, measured the blocked opening, then asked Cynthia for the document releasing the emergency easement. She didn't have one. That afternoon, I emailed him everything I had. The survey, the county permit search, the security video of Cynthia tearing up the map, and the meeting minutes where she admitted the board knew about the dispute. Marcus replied with 4 words. I'm forwarding this upstairs. The next morning, Cynthia sent another neighborhood email. She claimed the fire department had inspected the wall and found no problem. Then she increased my fines to $5,000. For about 24 hours, she looked like she had won. Then a certified envelope arrived at the HOA office. It was from Fire Marshal Elena Ruiz. The notice gave the HOA 72 hours. Stop all construction. Open a temporary emergency lane. Produce the permits. Provide legal proof that the recorded fire access easement had been released. If they couldn't, the obstruction had to come out. I assumed that would finally end it. I was wrong. Cynthia never showed the notice to the residents. She sent it directly to the HOA attorney and ordered the contractor to finish the decorative stonework. By Friday afternoon, the wall was complete. Then I saw a new announcement inside the clubhouse. Saturday, 9 a.m. Briar Ridge Security Wall. Official ribbon cutting. Saturday at 9 was exactly when the 72-hour deadline expired. Cynthia had invited homeowners, real estate agents, a local videographer. She called it the completion of Briar Ridge's secure future. She thought a crowd would make the county hesitate. She thought nobody would tear apart a brand new wall in front of cameras. Friday night, just before 8, my phone rang. Fire Marshal Ruiz. She didn't ask about Cynthia. She didn't ask about the board. She asked one question. "Mr. Mercer, how thick is that wall?" I looked through my kitchen window at the concrete stretching across the dirt road. Then I understood why she was asking. I went outside with a flashlight and tape measure. The wall was thicker than I expected. Reinforced concrete. Steel posts. Stone facing. Cynthia hadn't built something temporary. She had built something designed to stay. I sent the measurements to Ruiz. Then I stood there looking at the old road disappearing beneath all that concrete. My father had told me the story of that brush fire more times than I could count. I could still hear him. You never block the way help has to come through. An hour later, someone knocked on my door. A family from the lower valley stood outside. Their son had severe asthma. They had heard the fire department was reviewing the blocked road, and they wanted to know if it would reopen. That was the moment the whole thing stopped feeling like my fight with Cynthia. This wasn't about 18 inches of my property anymore. It wasn't about HOA fines. It wasn't even about a torn survey. If the main road became unusable during a wildfire, that dirt lane might be the only way an engine reached the valley. The next morning, Cynthia planned to celebrate the wall. She had no idea who else was coming. By 8:55 Saturday morning, half the neighborhood was standing in front of it. Cynthia had gone all out. A red ribbon stretched across the new stone entrance. A local videographer was filming. 2 real estate agents stood beside a banner. Briar Ridge, secure, private, premier. Cynthia stepped behind the microphone. Today, we finally closed the last unsecured entrance into our community. People applauded. I stood near the back. Then I heard diesel engines. Not one. Several. The crowd turned. First came the fire marshal's SUV. Then 2 fire engines. A county public works truck. And behind them, moving slowly up the road, was a yellow bulldozer. The applause disappeared. Fire Marshal Ruiz walked straight to Cynthia and handed her a document. "This is the final enforcement order." Cynthia barely looked at it. "You can't come onto HOA property and destroy private improvements." Ruiz pointed toward the wall. "Show me the recorded release of the emergency access easement." Cynthia reached into her folder and produced the resolution her own board had passed. Ruiz read it for maybe 5 seconds, then handed it back. "Your HOA cannot vote a recorded emergency route out of existence." For the first time that morning, Cynthia stopped smiling. But instead of backing down, she turned toward the HOA security guards. "Don't let them touch that wall." The guards looked at Cynthia, then at the bulldozer, then at the sheriff's deputy standing beside Ruiz. Neither one moved. Cynthia pointed toward the driver. "I said stop him." The deputy stepped forward. "Ma'am, interfering with an emergency enforcement order is not something I recommend." One guard backed away, then the other. Cynthia's face went red. "This is ridiculous. That easement isn't real. Daniel has been waving around some ancient map for months." I walked toward the fire marshal's truck. I opened my folder and laid the original recorded survey across the hood. Ruiz pointed to the red strip running beneath the wall. "Emergency fire access easement, recorded with the original subdivision plat." Then she moved her finger lower. "No permanent obstruction. Cynthia shook her head. He never showed us that. That was her mistake. I took out my phone. The security video began to play. There was Cynthia at the construction site. There was the survey in her hands. Then everyone heard her voice. One old piece of paper doesn't override the board. On the screen, she tore it apart. Nobody said a word. I looked at her. You weren't confused, Cynthia. You were warned. Ruiz folded the enforcement order, then turned toward the bulldozer operator. Clear the obstruction. The engine roared. The blade pressed against the center of the wall. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then a crack shot through the concrete. The decorative stone split. The Briar Ridge sign tilted forward. Cynthia screamed for them to stop. The bulldozer pushed again. An entire section collapsed into the dirt lane. Dust rolled across the ribbon-cutting chairs. The polished stone sign fell face first. On the next pass, the bulldozer's tracks rolled directly over the red ribbon Cynthia had planned to cut 10 minutes earlier. Nobody applauded. They just stared. For the first time since Cynthia had taken control of Briar Ridge, the residents weren't looking at her like the woman in charge. They were looking at her like the woman who had just cost them a fortune. And the wall wasn't the most expensive thing about to collapse. By Monday morning, the concrete was gone. The bills weren't. The HOA was charged for emergency removal, debris cleanup, restoring the fire lane, unpermitted construction. Then county officials started asking another question. Who approved the contract? That led straight back to Vale Development Services, Cynthia's brother-in-law. Homeowners learned the HOA had paid far more than 2 earlier estimates for the same project. Then they learned Cynthia had never disclosed the family connection. Worse, the financial records showed she authorized additional payments after the fire marshal's 72-hour order had already arrived. The money came from the HOA reserve fund. Money homeowners thought was being saved for roofs, drainage, and emergency repairs. Suddenly, the destroyed wall wasn't Cynthia's biggest problem. Residents began demanding bank statements, invoices, meeting records. Every major contract Cynthia had signed, and the more documents they opened, the quieter the board became. 3 days later, the clubhouse filled beyond capacity. Cynthia was still sitting in the president's chair, but nobody had come to hear her speak. They had come to see what was inside my binder. Cynthia opened the meeting by blaming me. She said I had weaponized county agencies against Briar Ridge. Then she called the destruction of the wall a technical misunderstanding. I waited until public comment. Then I carried my binder to the front table. I didn't make a speech. I opened it. First, the recorded survey. Then the video of Cynthia tearing it apart. Then the meeting minutes where she admitted the board knew about the easement and chose to build anyway. Then the fire marshal's 72-hour order. And finally, the contract with her brother-in-law's company. The room went completely silent. One homeowner stood. "You knew all of this?" Cynthia started talking about community safety. Another resident cut her off. "You spent our reserve money after you were ordered to stop?" That was when the board began turning on her. One member said he had never seen the fire marshal's notice. Another demanded an immediate vote. Cynthia tried to adjourn the meeting. Nobody moved. The vote happened anyway. By the end of the night, Cynthia Vale was no longer HOA president. My fines were canceled. 2 board members resigned. And every major contract Cynthia had signed was sent for independent review. I closed the binder. I had never needed to beat Cynthia in an argument. I only needed her decisions to survive long enough to become evidence. 6 weeks later, the dirt road behind my house looked different. The county had resurfaced it with compacted gravel. Red reflective posts marked both sides. And where Cynthia's polished stone monument once stood, there was a simple sign: Emergency Fire Access. Keep clear. The new HOA board adopted rules requiring public bids, conflict of interest disclosures, and county review before major construction projects. They asked me to run for president. I said no. I had spent enough years watching people confuse a title with authority. I did agree to help with the neighborhood wildfire committee. A year later, I stood on my porch and watched a fire engine roll down that road during an emergency drill. No wall, no locked gate, nothing blocking the way. Inside my house, I still keep the 2 torn pieces of that first survey framed above my desk. Underneath them is one sentence: paper doesn't have to look powerful. It only has to be right when the truth finally matters.